This is the time as a country we have to come together, we have to stay calm.
दोस्तों, बचाव आपके स्वयं के हाथ में है। आपके परिवार का, आपका, देश का बचाव सिर्फ आपके हाथ में है।
पैंडेमिक में सबसे जरूरी यही है, रिसोर्सेस का वहां इस्तेमाल होना जहां उसकी जरूरत है।
हम आपके लिए काम पर रहते हैं, आप हमारे लिए घर पर रहिए।
मेडिकल स्टाफ, नर्सेस, डॉक्टर्स हमारे लिए बहुत मेहनत कर रहे हैं।
Hats off to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, doctors.
Thank you, doctor.
Hi everyone, I'm Amrit Sanjeev and I work as a developer advocate in the developer relations team at Google. We hope all of you are enjoying 30 Days of Kotlin program and are excited to learn more today. In these challenging times, we are all navigating through uncertainty for ourselves, our loved ones, and our community. We hope that you are continue to take all the necessary precautions so that everyone around you is safe through these unusual times. Most of us are working from home now, even though that brings a lot of change to the way we're working and also adds challenges. We also see this as an opportunity to explore more and invest time into learning new things. I'm glad to see so many of you tuned into the great session. Last week, Kat and Lalit introduced us to Kat and Lalit conducted the introductory session to Kotlin. We also hope that you're enjoying learning Kotlin with the help of Code Labs. This week, David and I are going to discuss some of the best practices that can be adopted when using Kotlin in your project, and also share some of the success stories of companies that have already adopted Kotlin. These are some of the names that you might be familiar with and are already using Kotlin as their primary language for development. Before we start, let me ask you a quick question. If you haven't used Slido before, here are some of the instructions for it. Go to slido.com and enter the code X727. You will start seeing the question there. Okay, let's quickly do that. And start answering. If you're seeing the question, go ahead and answer that. Let's switch to the results. The question that you might be seeing here is, which of the code labs have you completed? Let's see some of the results that we've entered. That's interesting. A lot of people are answering. That's great. Most of you have selected option A. That's good to know. Let's go back to the presentation now. Let me now introduce my colleague David Winner, who's the product manager in Kotlin team at Google. He'll be talking through the first section today. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Amrit. Before we start talking about all of the great things about Kotlin and how it integrates with Android and Android development, I wanted to talk about the history of programming languages on Android. So we actually haven't introduced that many programming languages. The Android SDK was released in 2008, and with that, we had support for coding apps in the Java programming language. The very next year, in 2009, we added the Android Native Development Kit, our NDK, and that added C++ support. And then it was a full 8 years before we added support for our third language, Kotlin. And so what does it mean to add a new language on Android? We added support for Kotlin as a first-class language in 2017. And basically what that meant was adding support in the form of guides and docs and Android Studio actually bundling the Kotlin plugin. Then in 2018, we announced Android KTX, which brought idiomatic Kotlin to the Android platform and all of the Jetpack libraries. In 2019, we announced that we're going Kotlin first, making Kotlin our default language on Android. And today, I think this is the first time we've publicly said this, over 70% of the top 1,000 apps on the Google Play Store now use Kotlin. So really rapid growth in the Android ecosystem. So you've all been going through the code labs and working on projects in the last few weeks, and I wanted to quickly review what are some of our favorite features in the Kotlin language, and then actually ask you what yours are. So the first one is nullability being baked into the type system. So that question mark operator there on bundle basically means that saved instance state in this code example, in this main activity, could be nullable. And what that means is that you actually have to check to see if it's null or not. Why that's valuable is it actually helps you prevent null pointer exceptions in your code, as I think many of you know, especially those of you who completed the bootcamp course. And null pointer exceptions are one of the top exceptions that we see in apps in the wild. So it's really nice that Kotlin helps you get rid of them. Next, there's first-class support for lambdas. And it actually, in Kotlin, there's this nice syntax where if your lambda is your only parameter for a function, you can actually omit the parentheses in the function call and just open the parameter with braces, as you see here. Third is you can use template expressions and strings to avoid string concatenation, which can look a little messy in your code. And then fourth and finally, this is a minor thing, but you don't have to use semicolons, which looks really nice when you can kind of get rid of them. So those are specific features, but broadly, what do we really like about Kotlin? So the first is this idea of expressiveness or concision. You can basically say more with less code. Second is safety, which gets back to that nullability point, kind of that being baked into the type system. Third is that Kotlin is fully interoperable with the Java programming language. So you can introduce just one file or one class, your Java APIs from Kotlin seamlessly and vice versa, which means that it's really easy to just start using Kotlin on Android. You don't have to migrate all of your code over. And fourth and finally is this idea of structured concurrency. So Kotlin has a really nice primitive called coroutines that helps you handle asynchronous work. And coroutines has really good integration with the Android app lifecycle to make it easy for you to deal with exceptions, cancellation, and make sure that you're not leaking memory when you kick off an asynchronous task in your app. So I wanted to pause there for another question. We're all pros at this now. So if you open up Slido and go back to that same event code, X727, and I'll, oops. Actually, it looks like the question is actually listed on this slide. So I'll give everyone a second to fill it out. And then if we could, let's switch to the results and we can start seeing the answers come in. Yeah, so this is really interesting. It looks like the top one is fewer lines of code followed by null safety. Looks like integration with Jetpack might be coming up. Great. Yeah, well, so I mean, these really align with what we actually see when we talk to developers on our end too. It's great to see that so many folks are kind of enjoying the expressiveness and conciseness of Kotlin. Why don't we go back to the slides and we can go into a little bit more of the integration between Kotlin and Android. Let's go back. So next I want to talk about Kotlin and Jetpack. So what is Jetpack? Jetpack is a suite of libraries along with tools and guidance that actually come unbundled from the Android operating system. And it helps make complicated tasks easier. And it helps you kind of write code that targets both very old versions of Android and new versions of Android all at the same time. And so when you import these libraries into your app, you'll be able to tell what they are because they're all under the package name Android X, which is why you kind of see that stylized in code here. So Android X or Jetpack is really prominent in the Android community. It's actually pretty new, this set of libraries that kind of support you in app development. But They've already been adopted by all of the apps on this page, many of which you probably recognize. And we actually looked at data from the Play Store, and from the top 10,000 apps by install on the Play Store, 84% of them are using one or more Jetpack libraries. So really wide usage that we're seeing. And you've probably actually, if you've gone through the Android Code Lab so far, you've probably used some of them yourself. So as we started looking at these libraries, we realized that they were written originally in the Java programming language. But we introduced support for Kotlin in 2017, and we really wanted to make them easier to use from Kotlin. And this is something we heard over and over again from developers. I started using Kotlin, but my Java programming language APIs, like Jetpack, don't feel as expressive. So I want to explain an example of how we address this, and then show you kind of how this is trickled down through the entire sort of Android API ecosystem. So this is an example of a Java API. It's the shared preferences class. So this is a class that helps you store user preferences in key value pairs. So first you retrieve an editor that helps you actually add preferences. And then in this example, we're adding two Booleans. And so the editor has these methods, put Boolean, put string, put long, etc., that let you save user preferences. And then because each of those put methods returns an editor, you can chain them together. And then you call apply at the very end to save those preferences. And this works fine, but there's one potential issue, which is that it's not a very idiomatic way to do this in Kotlin. So let me show you what we've added in Kotlin. So Kotlin provides this nice syntax where if your function's only parameter is a lambda, you don't need parentheses, and you can just use braces to enclose the lambda. So this code makes use of an extension function in Kotlin on that shared preferences class, where you can now pass a lambda to the edit method. And that lambda makes these two put Boolean calls, and then the extension function takes care of calling apply for you too. And it leads this really nice declarative looking style where instead of chaining together a bunch of put calls and then calling apply, you're almost visually opening up an editor in code, making the edits that you want, and then closing it with an end brace. And so if you kind of look at the code, it better visually represents what you're trying to do with that shared preferences object. So this is just the code that makes that possible. It's the definition of that extension function on shared preferences. The core KTX library, which is the library that you pull in to do this, has an extension function on shared preferences that overrides edit. And the extension function takes a lambda with your edit action, so those put Booleans. And what the function does is it creates an editor, calls the action lambda, passing in the editor, and then it calls apply for you. And so all that's to say is that Kotlin provides the flexibility to create more concise, more expressive and declarative code. And we've done some work to kind of make that possible for you using Android KTX. So before moving on to kind of broadly how this is permeated through Android, I wanted to jump in with a quiz question. So that syntax or that pattern in Kotlin, where you kind of open up a more declarative lambda, what is that pattern called? I'll give everyone a second to think about the answer. Okay, it looks like we're getting a lot of different answers. So far the leading answer is coroutine, but not by much. Delegation coming up. Okay, it looks like the answers might be slowing down. So if possible, could we reveal the right answer? I'm not sure if we have that tech on our end yet, so I'll spoil it. So the right answer is actually type safe builder. And this is a sort of pattern that comes up over and over again in Kotlin. And it's actually in some of the Jetpack libraries, although this was a tricky question because it's not always referred to that way. We will get more into coroutines, which is another one of these patterns, in a second, though. So actually, why don't we go back to the slides, and then we can go through some of the other ways that we've integrated Android with Jetpack. So in order to pull in this initial set of KTX or core KTX, all you have to do is you just add this one line dependency in your project, and it adds all this nice Kotlin sugar on top of the existing libraries in the Android platform. But there are KTX extensions not just for kind of the core Android platform, but also almost all of the Jetpack libraries that you probably have used, especially if you've gone through the Android code labs. And to add them to your project, you just add the KTX dependency for that library. And so we talked about type safe builders. That was the pattern I just showed you. And there's actually a number of other patterns that are provided by KTX. So extension functions are one. There are these things called operator overloads in Kotlin, property delegates. And then the last one, which we alluded to in the beginning, is coroutines. I'll get into that in a second, but I will say, if you go to this link that's displayed here, developer.android.com/Kotlin/KTX, it has a full list of these Kotlin extensions and some guides for how to start integrating them into your app to make sure it's really idiomatically Kotlin. So let's talk about coroutines. Coroutines are basically a really lightweight way to manage currency. And we've added support for them in many of the Android Jetpack libraries. So if you've gone through the code labs, you're probably familiar with viewModel, and there's a viewModel coroutine scope that we provide there. There's also integration with Lifecycle, Room, Work Manager, Live Data, and there are more of these libraries coming. We've really invested a lot in coroutines because we think they're a pretty powerful construct. Let me just show you an example of what this looks like in viewModel. So here we're looking at a viewModel, and as you may know, all coroutines need to execute in a scope. So here inside the context of the viewModel, you can use viewModel scope, and the viewModel scope is what launches any of the asynchronous work you want to do in your app. And then when viewModel is cleared, your viewModel scope automatically gets cleaned up and any coroutine gets canceled, and that basically ensures that you're not leaking memory. And so what we've done here is we've actually tied coroutines, which are a Kotlin concept, to the Android lifecycle, which is very sort of firmly an Android concept, and made it a lot easier to use these Kotlin idioms with your app in that way. You might be wondering, how do I access all of this Kotlin goodness? And fortunately, it's pretty easy. If you just go to any of the documentation, so this is just an example, the androidx.core.content package, and make sure you're on the Kotlin tab, it will show you the Kotlin support that's kind of built in for that documentation, and it will include the Kotlin extensions as well for that library so that you know that you're getting access to all of the sort of latest and greatest Kotlin versions of these libraries. Great. So the very last thing I wanted to cover is Kotlin and Android Studio. As many of you know, Android Studio is the official IDE for Android app development. And Kotlin comes bundled with Android Studio, and we've added a lot into it to make Kotlin development really great. So there are lint checks, for example, in Android Studio to make your Kotlin code more idiomatic. There's also Kotlin-specific refactorings, Kotlin templates, and we've even been going through the Android SDK and annotating Java methods and properties with special annotations that tell the Kotlin compiler if they're nullable or not. So even if you're calling a Java method from Kotlin, you can use that nullability that helps you avoid null pointer exceptions and crashes in your app. There's also tools inside of Android Studio to ensure your Java code is interoperable with Kotlin. So to find a list of these, you can check out the inspection preferences in Android Studio. And then my personal favorite feature is Kotlin will actually do a best effort conversion for you of your Java code. It's a really good way to learn Kotlin if you're newer to the language. And what you basically do is you copy some Java programming language code, paste it into your Kotlin file, and then Android Studio will convert it for you. And so you can really see what your typical Java constructs are in Kotlin. So yeah, that's everything on the libraries and tools side. And now I'm actually going to pass things over to Amrit to tell you about some of the top apps that use Kotlin and the successes they've seen.
Thanks, David. For the next few slides, I want to talk to you about the companies that have adopted Kotlin as their primary language for development and share some of the interesting stats that they have shared with us over the last few months. All of these companies have millions of users, and in fact, 3 of them have over 100 million users, and many of them have several million daily active users. Just to call out, Indian developers are more practical and pragmatic in their approach to adoption of technology into their production apps. And because of this, most of these companies did their own independent research, and they took a very deliberate decision based on their findings of their studies to switch to Kotlin. Nearly all of them decided to go with a mixed language approach. And the fact that Kotlin can interop with Java seamlessly made the decision to switch over to Kotlin a lot more easier. Another advantage that the teams actually realized when they actually decided to switch to Kotlin is that they had more options in terms of components and libraries to choose from. Some of them were more efficient, whereas some of them were easier to use than existing options that were available in Java. Many teams decided to write all the new code in Kotlin and invested heavily in educating their team on standards and best practices in Kotlin. They were excited to see the results, and that too without waiting for too long. Like I mentioned earlier, each of these slides is going to be one company and what they feel are some of the interesting stats they were able to achieve switching over to Kotlin. So let's start with the first one. Well, first one, let's take it from Google itself. The Google Home team actually switched to writing all new features in Kotlin. They claim this has to be a much more happier and more efficient team after the switch. They reduced their null point exceptions by about 30%. Even though this seems like, okay, null pointer exceptions, it's something that we can work with. It's if you've ever worked on a very large project, you know that this is a very difficult problem to kind of solve, and takes quite a lot of time and effort to get it reduced by this much. But switching over to Kotlin, it allowed them to do this. And they were also writing more concise code, 60 to 80% for some of the files that they were switching over. It's not just development effort in terms of typing in or developer time that is actually saved here. Then there's less code to review. There's less code to kind of correct. There's less code to document. So all of these places, you're clawing back time, which we can use in order to kind of maybe advance the product a little further. So they were very happy with this change. Let's take an example from the real world, third-party apps. Flipkart, we all know this app. It's used by millions of users daily. They actually switched to Kotlin and saw a 30% reduction in code size. And they also saw that they were taking significantly less amount of time to stabilize the build when they were actually pushing it to production, something in the order of 20%. And all that time was clawed back basically from having to deal with less issues in the code. And there's also less time that they were spending on code review. Code review time, they said, were reduced by something like 20%. And they were using KTX extensively, and they reduced nearly 95% of their common issues that they were seeing with code. And they recently did a survey, which was very interesting, where they asked all their developers how much would they estimate for the same module in Java as well as in Kotlin. And they saw that 50% of their developers actually gave an estimate smaller for the Kotlin version of for the same module. And they were delighted that they made this decision to kind of switch over to Kotlin. Moving on, Swiggy. Swiggy was one of the early adopters of Kotlin from the top partner base. They actually switched nearly 3/4 of their code to Kotlin. And their best thing that they have realized so far is their time to roll out to 100% for a new build has reduced by over 75%, which means that they are able to stabilize the new build, receive less crashes, and they are more confident in rolling out the build much faster to more users in production without having any negative impact to their reviews or to the user experience. And all that bandwidth saved they're also saving a lot of bandwidth in terms of developer QA on call. Because there are less errors and code to call out, the interaction between QA and the developer, the amount of time they are going back and forth, has reduced significantly. They say up to 60%. And that's a huge saving for a company which is having that high velocity. They churn out code really quickly. They are releasing, their release cycles are quite frequent. And that to keep that velocity going, they really need to keep a very high standard of uh, crash free sessions and things like that. So they've been very delighted to report that 50% reduction in crashes. The common crashes were reduced by 50% after moving Kotlin. So a lot of that could be null pointer exceptions and things like that. But you should understand from a user's perspective, this is a delightful experience. They have an app which they can rely on, more stable. Swiggy being an extremely transactional app, if you break the workflow of the user, it's very difficult to kind of get the user back. The user might most probably discard the workflow. So it's very important for them that there are no crashes happen from their start of the user's journey to the end. And they're able to achieve this a lot better when they're actually move to Kotlin. There are also more bandwidth that they're saving because of all these gains. That bandwidth is used by the team to kind of support older versions of the app, it seems. And that is great because with a team that is rolling out more features and more features for the users, they are able to support more older versions. As many of you might know, in India, not a lot of users upgrade as quickly to the latest version. They might turn off auto update in Google Play, basically because they are afraid of the bandwidth consumption and things like that. And just that is just habit from the days where data was very expensive. They just still have that habit of keeping auto updates off and things like that. But now with support for older versions, they're able to delight the users a lot better. Interestingly, Swiggy has also made their PR system, that's a push request. Whenever somebody checks in some code, the build will fail if there is a file which is in Java. So they are taking this very seriously to move to Kotlin. Moving on to the next partner. That's Daily Hunt. Daily Hunt is one of the vernacular apps in the country. And they have a huge daily active user base. And they've been able to reduce their code size by 30%. One of their things that they've said is that their review times are a lot faster. And that's enabling them to push out builds a lot earlier than before. And there's about 10% reduction in their crash rate, which is mostly from null pointer exceptions that they in their analysis. That's what they've revealed. And there's about a 30% reduction in development effort. And that's a huge thing for them because 30% is additional time their developers could spend in building the next feature and be extremely competitive in the market. And they're because of all this, they're releasing apps to production a lot faster, and they see that their stability is as good or better than before. Moving on to the next one, Zomato. 60% of their code base is migrated to Kotlin. Zomato is a team that actually has an amazing velocity in terms of builds. So they really were careful in terms of the fact that they wanted to keep their new features and be very dynamic to the market as quickly and release out new features as quickly as possible. So they wanted to ensure that their velocity never goes down. And they've seen that moving to Kotlin, they've been able to reduce their code size drastically. Again, review times dropping off quickly. They've been able to quickly create new versions and new features and roll it out with the desired stability levels a lot faster and with more confidence than they were doing earlier with Java. And that's definitely something that this team has taken in, and that's why more and more code effort is actually put in migrating their existing code base. And right now, they're at about 60% of their code base to be written complete, to be migrated into Kotlin. And all new features and all new code that they're writing are actually in Kotlin now. And the last one I want to mention is Woot. They are a video on demand platform with over 100 million users, user base. And they've attained a code reduction of nearly 50% by switching over to Kotlin. They had an amazingly high crash-free rate, but they were able to improve that drastically, again by 0.5 to 0.6% in their overall crash rate was reduced, which means their Android vitals became a lot better. And this, for them, the impact is huge because of their large user base. the improvement is like more than 500,000 users are not seeing those regular crashes anymore. And that is huge gain by just switching over to a new language and writing and migrating over to it. And their null point exception rate is 2 to 4 for 10,000 sessions. That's really, really low. There are weeks where they don't have any of these exceptions, and once in a while they get one, is what they have reported to us. And this sort of numbers always tell us that these migrations and the adoption of Kotlin has only positively benefited these teams, and they have already taken it as a standard within these companies, and they're exploring new libraries and the extensions and additional things that we are actually rolling out. And the adoption has been extremely positive from the top partners. I've only mentioned 5 here, but that doesn't mean these are the only people who are doing it. Nearly most of the top partners have already migrated to Kotlin. It's only due to the interest of time that I'm not able to call out the others. But Kotlin is by far the standard that nearly all the top partner engineering teams here are using now. Now to sum off, David and I shared today the best practices and tips to adopt and take advantage of when moving to Kotlin. And I followed it up with some of the results that partner teams have seen when using Kotlin. So David, what is that one takeaway that you want to call out at this point of time to our viewers?
Yeah, thanks, Amrit. Well, so I know you've come 16 days so far in the 30 days of Kotlin journey. You've done several code labs so far. So I guess what I would say is just know that on the Android side, we're really committed to Kotlin in terms of integration with the tools and libraries, and get ready for the project submission phase. We're excited to see what you all create.
And wait, don't drop off now. There's more instructions for you. Before you drop off, there are a few things I want to call out. Firstly, earlier this month, you had asked us questions on Kotlin through the Ask Google Devs India form. We are working hard in answering those questions, and the video with all the answers will be available by the end of this month. Secondly, keep sharing your progress with us on Twitter with the hashtag 30 days of Kotlin. And don't forget to tag the Google Devs India Twitter handle. And lastly, and importantly, don't forget to fill the feedback form that you've been seeing on the screen for some time now. This gives us great insight into how we can improve for the upcoming sessions. That's it from us today. Thanks for joining, and see you in the next one. Bye.